There's a strange feeling you can't fully explain. You're living your life. You're functioning. You're talking to people. You're working, studying, scrolling, laughing sometimes. But underneath it all, something feels off. It's like you're present but not really there. Like you're watching your own life from a distance instead of actually living it. And the hardest part is this: you don't even know when it started. Feeling disconnected from yourself doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. At some point, you started prioritizing survival over self-awareness. Maybe it was expectations. Maybe it was pressure. Maybe it was responsibility. You had to grow up fast. You had to be strong. You had to perform. And when survival becomes the priority, self-connection becomes optional. You stopped asking yourself how you felt. You started asking what needed to be done. Over time, that shift creates distance, because connection with yourself requires presence, and presence requires emotional safety. If your environment never felt fully safe, emotionally or psychologically, you learn to detach instead of feel. Detachment can look like productivity. It can look like independence. It can even look like maturity, but internally it feels like numbness. You might notice it in small ways. You struggle to answer simple questions like, what do you actually want? You don't know what excites you anymore. You don't know what makes you genuinely happy versus what just distracts you. You make decisions based on logic or expectations, not desire. That's not because you don't have desires. It's because you've stopped listening to them. Disconnection often begins when you start shaping yourself to fit external approval, when you learn that being your natural self isn't always rewarded. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive, too emotional, too loud, too quiet, too different, so you adjusted, you edited yourself, you became more acceptable. And every time you edit yourself to fit in, you move a little further away from who you naturally are. At first it feels necessary. You gain acceptance. You avoid conflict. You feel included. But gradually, you forget what parts were original and what parts were adapted. You start living as a version of yourself that works, but doesn't feel authentic. Another reason you feel disconnected is because you've been constantly distracted. Modern life rarely gives you silence. There's always noise, notifications, content, conversations, tasks. And when your mind is constantly stimulated, there's no space for reflection. Silence is where connection happens, but silence can also feel uncomfortable. When you sit alone without distraction, thoughts surface, emotions rise, questions appear, and if you've been avoiding those questions for a long time, you'll avoid silence too. So you stay busy, not because you love being busy, but because stillness feels unfamiliar. Disconnection can also come from emotional suppression. Maybe you experienced pain that you never processed. Maybe you went through disappointment, heartbreak, rejection, failure, and instead of sitting with it, you moved on quickly. You told yourself to stay strong, to not dwell, to not overthink. But unprocessed emotions don't disappear, they get stored. And when you store too much without release, your system protects you by numbing you. Numbness doesn't just block pain, it blocks joy too. That's why you might feel neutral about things that used to excite you. That's why achievements feel empty. That's why even happy moments sometimes feel distant. It's not that you don't care. It's that your emotional system has been in protection mode. Another subtle cause of disconnection is living according to expectations instead of identity. If your major life decisions, career, relationships, goals, were chosen based on what made sense to others, you may have built a life that looks stable but feels foreign. You wake up inside routines that don't reflect your inner world. And because everything seems fine, you feel guilty for feeling disconnected. You tell yourself you should be grateful, you shouldn't complain, others have it worse. But disconnection isn't about comparison, it's about alignment. You can have everything you thought you wanted and still feel far from yourself if those things don't match who you're becoming. Growth can also create disconnection. When you evolve internally but your environment stays the same, you feel out of sync. Conversations that once excited you now feel shallow. Goals that once motivated you now feel forced. You're changing, but your surroundings don't reflect that change yet. That gap feels like confusion. And confusion often feels like losing yourself, when in reality, you might be discovering a new version of yourself. Sometimes you feel disconnected because you've never actually been introduced to yourself beyond roles: student, worker, friend, partner, child, provider. But who are you outside of what you do for others? If your identity has always been role-based, then when roles shift or feel empty, you feel empty too. Because you were never taught to build an identity rooted in values, curiosity, and self-awareness. Disconnection isn't a flaw, it's often a signal. A signal that you've been living outward for too long. A signal that your inner world has been waiting for attention. And the more you ignore that signal, the louder the emptiness feels. There's another layer to this feeling that most people don't talk about. Sometimes you feel disconnected from yourself because you're afraid of what you might find if you reconnect. What if you realize you're unhappy? What if you realize you want something completely different from the life you've built? What if reconnecting means changing things that feel stable but unfulfilling? It's easier to stay slightly detached than to face those possibilities. Disconnection can feel safer than transformation, because transformation requires decisions, and decisions disrupt comfort. You might also feel disconnected because you've been living in comparison for too long. When you constantly measure yourself against others, their success, their relationships, their confidence, you lose touch with your own pace, your own desires, your own timeline. Comparison pulls your focus outward, connection pulls it inward. If your attention is always outward, you lose the inner voice. And that inner voice becomes faint. Another reason is chronic stress. When you're under continuous pressure, your brain prioritizes survival. It focuses on solving problems, meeting deadlines, avoiding failure. There's no room for introspection when you're in constant performance mode. Over time, performance becomes identity. You become what you produce. And when you're alone without tasks, you don't know who you are without productivity. That's disconnection. You may also struggle to name your emotions. You feel something but you can't explain it. Is it sadness? Is it boredom? Is it anxiety? Is it exhaustion? Without emotional vocabulary, feelings turn into fog, and fog creates distance. It's hard to feel connected to something you can't define. But hear the truth: disconnection is not permanent. It's a state, not an identity. Reconnection doesn't require dramatic life changes. It starts small. It starts with noticing. Noticing what drains you. Noticing what energizes you. Noticing what feels forced and what feels natural. Paying attention to moments when you feel slightly more alive, slightly more present. Reconnection begins with honesty. Honesty about what you're tired of pretending is okay. Honesty about what you miss. Honesty about what you've been avoiding. You don't have to fix everything immediately. You just have to acknowledge it. Spending time alone without distraction can feel uncomfortable at first, but that discomfort is the doorway. Journaling, walking without headphones, sitting quietly. These simple acts rebuild familiarity with your own thoughts. You are not disconnected because you are broken. You are disconnected because at some point, disconnecting helped you survive. But survival is not the same as living. Living requires awareness. Awareness requires courage. And courage requires vulnerability with yourself. The goal isn't to suddenly find yourself like a lost object. The goal is to slowly remove the layers that covered you. Under the expectations, under the distractions, under the roles, under the fear, you're still there. The reason you feel disconnected from yourself isn't because you disappeared. It's because you adapted. An adaptation kept you safe. Now, maybe you're ready for something more than safety. Maybe you're ready for alignment. Reconnecting with yourself isn't loud. It's quiet. It's choosing authenticity in small moments. It's listening to your instincts instead of ignoring them. It's admitting when something doesn't feel right instead of forcing yourself to tolerate it. And slowly the distance shortens. You begin to recognize your own voice again. You begin to feel present in your own life. And one day, you realize something important. You were never truly lost. You were just waiting to come back to yourself.